Well, welcome to episode 305 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this is a special episode, which means I don't have to stick to 10 minutes. And it's on a theme which came to me kind of in the middle of the night when I was thinking about what to do next. And I realized I had a whole bunch of records which were basically jazz trios, specifically piano trios, but that a lot of those records were really quite distinct from the others. And then I also thought, well, maybe out there are people wondering, hankering after jazz piano trio records, not really certain what to invest in or what to seek out. And I thought, well, why don't I go through some examples? And so what I've got here is 16 different jazz piano trio records, really quite different, many of them in style from one to the other. I'm going to talk about some very obvious ones that are well known first, but for the most part, these are records which I think are pretty good, mostly fly under the radar these days. There's not a lot of talk about them. Sometimes there haven't been that many reissues, and which for the most part, not always, can be picked up for not too much money. So I'll start off with four really pretty obvious records, and the first of these is Nina Simone's debut record called Little Girl Blue. This was on Bethlehem Records. It comes out in 1959. This is a great record for, well, many reasons, not least, of course, the music on here, but it's also great because Nina, as you can see, I think, here, let me just focus on that, has an expression which is kind of indicative of what she was going through with respect to this record, which was not great because she'd been signed to Bethlehem by a guy called Gus Wilde, or Wilde, not sure, who loved her music. And they had a whole session. They recorded 14 songs, but then Wilde was running out of cash. So he does a deal with this guy called Sid Nathan of King Records. And Sid Nathan wants to pick the track list for this record. So he goes over to see Nina at her house. And Nina says, screw you. This is the track list I want. So Nathan gets in a huff and he refuses to do any promotion for this and basically tries to bury this record. DJs, however, get hold of it, and in particular, the very first track, I Loves You Porgy, which of course is from the Gershwin musical, becomes a big hit. In fact, it's the biggest hit that Bethlehem Records ever had. So reluctantly, he's now going to put this out, and he puts out the record. I suspect the photo shoot is sometime during this because she looks kind of annoyed. And by the time the record comes out, she'd actually buggered off. She'd sold the rights to all these songs for $3,000 to Nathan, and she was in fact now signed to Colpix Records. This record is Nina Simone, backed up by Jimmy Bond and Tootie Heath, and it has some amazing music on it. I mentioned I Loves You Porgy, but there's also that track which had a second wind, strangely enough, in the 1980s, My Baby Just Cares for Me. Even though this is early in her career, and this is basically her club set, you get very characteristically Nina Simone, bluesy, very wry vocal deliveries. There are also some instrumentals on here as well, so you get to hear her piano playing unaccompanied by vocals. Anyway, it's a tremendous record, and you can get some of these more recent releases anyway. And when I talk about releases, I'm not talking about bogus Russian what have yous, but reasonable, properly sourced pressings. You can get some for not too much money these days. The next record that I want to talk about, again, these are not very surprising. These are kind of greatest hits kinds of piano trios, is this fantastic record by Bill Evans and his trio of Scott LaFaro and Paul Motion, Sunday at the Village Vanguard, made in 1961. This is arguably, well, one of the greatest jazz records of all time, let alone piano trio records. It has, of course, the added pathos of being recorded very shortly before Scott LaFaro, that amazing bassist, the guy who, along with Charlie Haydn, really reinvented bass playing in the early 1960s, dies in a car crash. If you like this one, you'll also want to pick up Waltz for Debbie, which of course was made at the same time during the same sessions and released as a separate record. This is some of the most intimately and beautifully recorded, melancholy and yet somehow uplifting kind of rainy day jazz music. It's almost perfect music for any emotion, any occasion, and I never, ever get tired of listening to this, and nor should you. The next record, which again is kind of a famous record, is this one by McCoy Tyner, who of course was John Coltrane's pianist in the early to mid 1960s, Inception. And this is his very first record as a leader. He's backed up by Elvin Jones, his bandmate on drums in the John Coltrane Quartet, and of course Art Davis on bass. This is a super impressive debut. It includes a number of originals, which are probably the strongest songs in the record, which is an additional reason why it's so impressive. Inception, Effendi, and the very, very beautiful Sunset are all his compositions. And if you come to this record having first heard the stuff that he did as a solo artist in the late 60s and in the 1970s, you're going to find this surprising because it's very lyrical, kind of light feeling, and almost bebopish in parts. In any event, this is not a record that anyone's going to regret ever picking up. Now, the fourth record, which I'm going to talk about, which is basically a classic, not very surprising kind of jazz trio record, is this one, variously called Thelonious or Monk or what have you, but this is essentially a compilation of two 10-inch records called Thelonious from 1953 and Thelonious Plays from 1954, which Prestige slapped together to make into a full long-playing 12-inch record in 1956. And this is Monk in his full flourishing of genius, despite the fact that personally he's at a very low ebb at this point. He's had his cabaret card confiscated by the NYPD because he refused to testify against Bud Powell in a drug charge. And even though he himself was not the subject of a criminal proceeding, the NYPD had the authority and the right just to yank his cabaret card, which you needed to play in New York clubs, which of course was the center of the jazz world. So he was spending his time bouncing around the rest of the country and coming into New York to record for Prestige, and that's how we get this record. It is, for the most part, as you might expect, relentlessly swinging bop, but it's also really characteristic Monk, and you get so much of that very typical kind of off-kilter and sometimes atonal playing. And a trio setting for Monk is interesting because it really gives him a very simple palette onto which he can paint all kinds of really experimental kinds of colors. And so basically, when you listen to this, it's great all the way through, but expect the unexpected. The best example of that might be that wistful and kind of discordant version of Just a Gigolo on side one. Okay, so much for the bleeding obvious. Now let's move on to some records that are slightly off the beaten track, or you might occasionally see, as in the case of this next one, in bargain bins. And if you do, they should be snapped up. So the first one I want to talk about is this record, The In Crowd by the Ramsey Lewis Trio. Now the Ramsey Lewis Trio is a group which doesn't always get a lot of critical cred because Ramsey Lewis's formula was basically to take popular songs and do soul jazz interpretations of them. And this, of course, was seen as not as noble a pursuit as what people like Miles or Coltrane or others were doing in the mid-1960s. The trouble is that the music is absolutely great, and this seems to get lost in and amongst all of the critical hand-wringing about, artistic integrity and so on. And you can tell the music is great because this is a live recording and the crowd are just loving it. And that is part of the excitement of this record. It's live at the Bohemian Caverns Club in Washington. What I absolutely love is the picture of this this limousine on the front cover. And it is jazzy, it's funky, it's swinging 60s, it's a little bit bossa. As I said, the crowd is stoked. He's backed up here by two members of his trio who would soon depart, L.D. Young and Red Holt. And this record is a big seller. It's one of Lewis's best sellers, and on the strength of that, Young and Holt decide to take off. So it's out with the old, and then a year later, in with the new, because Young and Holt have formed the Young-Holt Trio, which is the next record I want to talk about. And this is L.D. Young, the bass player. This is Red Holt, the drummer. And this is a guy called Heiser Don Walker. Now, more about him in a second. But this record, too, follows on in the slightly pop-oriented soul jazz vein that Ramsey Lewis had mined so successfully and would continue to mine so successfully for a number of years. He didn't end up that badly. The drummer he recruited to fill Red Holt's place was actually Maurice White, who would make his name with Lewis and then go on to found Earth, Wind & Fire. This particular version of Young and Holt's group is actually kind of rare because they go on to form a smaller group called Young-Holt Unlimited, which was much better known. There are fleeting glimpses of this trio playing on YouTube. They appear on a Fred Astaire hosted variety show at one point. And Walker himself is a real mystery because he's a guy who then goes on to make two records in the early 1970s which feature Fender Rhodes, and the records feature a bunch of compositions by people like Roberta Flack, all done in a super, super funky style. Some of the best Fender Rhodes playing I've ever heard in my life. But you cannot find anything about this guy on the internet. And I've actually been trying to do a workup on him to talk about those records because those two Complete Expressions records are so, so good. But you can find nothing. There's no Wikipedia page. This is, frankly, the only actual decent photograph of him that exists as far as I can tell anywhere. I did track down his nephew, and I've interviewed his nephew, but I'm still looking for a bit more information. Anyway, if you're out there and you know more about Heiser Walker, who was from Evanston, Illinois, I'd love to hear from you. This record itself had a pretty big hit on it, a song called Whack Whack. They never really replicated that. With this version, soon Walker was gone, and then they'd reinvented themselves as Young-Holt Unlimited. So much for the soul jazz bits, although we may get back to that in a little while. Let's now talk about this record from 1956. And again, just like the Monk record, this is basically mined off of two earlier 10-inch LPs, all bolted together to form one single LP. And it is, of course, by the Dave Brubeck, not the quartet, but the Dave Brubeck Trio. So this somewhat violates my normal rule with respect to Brubeck, which is nothing with an orchestra and nothing without Paul Desmond. So this is without Paul Desmond. What you have on here is Dave Brubeck, obviously playing piano, as always, like his life depends on it. Cal Tjader on vibes and drums and bongos, depending on the song, and a friend of Tjader's that Tjader had brought into the group, a guy called Ron Crotty, who plays on a lot of early Brubeck stuff and then basically disappears off the map. And this has, amongst other things, this amazing Arnold Roth illustration on the, there we go, on the cover with the doctor, optometrist guy looking at the naked but nippleless lady in the window. Anyway, so whatever the merits of that particular thingy, this is a super interesting record. It has, again, Brubeck's playing it's an acquired taste when you hear it absent the very sort of subtle relief that Desmond brings, because he often feels like he's sort of descending his hands onto the piano keys from a great height. In fact, there's a very funny little video, and I encourage you to look it up, of Andre Previn talking to Oscar Peterson, and they're talking about Dave Brubeck, and Previn saying that he hated going to clubs to play when Dave Brubeck had previously been booked in there because the piano would be in terrible shape, because Brubeck had been just pounding on this, and Peterson makes excuses for Brubeck, says, basically Dave used to get excited. This is a pretty interesting record historically because it's got Brubeck and Tjader, who would go their separate ways pretty soon, but were together, of course, in Brubeck's octet, with Tjader playing bongos and vibes, and you can already hear the seeds of his tangent that he would take into Latin jazz in just a few years. The music, I would say, is pretty good. It depends on the track. Sometimes Brubeck's playing is great. Sometimes I personally find it a bit overbearing. Tjader's vibes are pretty cool. His bongo work is excellent. So you kind of pick and choose here, but definitely worth exploring. So next, we have this record from somebody who really is known for piano trios, and that is Ahmad Jamal. And this is the Ahmad Jamal Trio's record on Epic, self-titled, from 1955. And this is superb. And it's interesting because it has a slightly different lineup. I guess the classic piano trio lineup is piano, bass, drums. But here we have piano, bass, guitar, because we've got Jamal with Israel Crosby, wonderful, wonderful bass player, and on guitar, Ray Crawford. Crawford himself is an interesting guy because he actually originally came to fame with the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra during the war, but there he was a woodwind player. But then he got tuberculosis and had to give up playing wind instruments, and so he picks up a guitar. So that's a pretty unusual musical trajectory, but I'm really glad that he's on here because I am kind of two minds about Ahmad Jamal. I really do like his later work in the 70s. Like, I love the album The Awakening, but I'm not that keen, I find, sometimes on some of his work from the 1950s, which can actually be quite celebrated. And of course, famously, Miles Davis was heavily influenced by Jamal's use on his recordings and his club dates of space and minimalism. And so it's pretty well established that when Davis was leading up to composing and then recording and performing Kind of Blue, he was listening to a lot of Ahmad Jamal and listening to the notes, quote unquote, that he didn't play, as well as the ones that he did. But for me, what I find about Jamal is I love that use of space and the quiet pieces and just the openness of the compositions, but I'm not that keen always on his tendency to play very, very high up on the register of the piano in his right hand. It sounds all a bit sort of too tinkly, and I kind of wish he played more in the mid-range. Just personal taste, but that's my impression. But here, because the guitar adds a second truly melodic instrument, there is relief from Jamal's tendencies. And so I think this actually comes across a lot better than, say, records which are generally considered to be more famous, more interesting, better records, like his record Volume 4 or Poinciana or so on. Anyway, not only do I suspect, I'm sure lots of people disagree with that assessment, but if you like that sound of bass, guitar, and piano, this is an absolutely tremendous record. Perfidia, Love for Sale, all the way through, these tracks are just wonderful. And again, just nice piece of variety out of just 3 instruments. So much for Ahmad Jamal. And now let's talk about something which is a little bit of a change of pace, which is a record by the Vince Guaraldi Trio, Jazz Impressions of Black Orpheus. Now this comes out on Fantasy Records in 1962, and this is maybe best summed up in one phrase as Charlie Brown Goes to Ipanema, because this record is essentially Guaraldi's take on the soundtrack to a very famous film, Black Orpheus, which comes out in 1959. It wins the Cannes Palme d'Or. The next year it wins the Best Foreign Film Oscar. It's made in Brazil, and it's based on a play by Vinicius de Moraes, who was one of the founders of Bossa Nova and a lyricist and a poet. And the music to the play and then to the film was composed by Vinicius, but also by Antonio Carlos Jobim. Now, the film comes out, it's a very popular film, but Bossa Nova doesn't launch internationally from that film. It only comes out in 1959. And Bossa Nova doesn't become a big international thing until Stan Getz and Charlie Bird get their hands on it in 1962. This record then is done at the height of the Bossa Nova craze, and Guaraldi is now reaching back into what is now understood to be foundational Bossa Nova stuff. And there are some Bossa Nova classics on here, or the songs that would become Bossa Nova classics, like A Felicidade and Manhã de Carnaval, and there are takes of those tracks on here. All that said, this is not a Bossa Nova record. It's pretty much a straight up West Coast jazz interpretation of these Bossa Nova melodies and themes. But what it is a fantastic jazz record, and I thoroughly encourage you to pick this up and give it a spin. Now, the next record I want to talk about is a record by a guy who wrote a very famous song and saw other people become quite famous playing it. He, of course, got the royalties, but here plays probably his best version of it. And this is Billy Taylor with his trio in 1968. And this is a truly terrible album cover with a really kind of substandard pencil drawing and some rather tedious, what looks like watercolor washed over top of it. And then somebody else has decided that this cover was not bad enough, so they've named it MISC 2924, apparently in 2 places and also on the back, just in case you missed the coding for wherever this was being filed in Sharpie land. Anyway, all that to say, this is a superb record. It is named for the title track, I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free, which of course Taylor had written in 1959 and becomes a civil rights standard all the way through the 1960s. It's a very, very beautiful track. It has lyrics, of course, but here it's an instrumental version. Nina Simone, in particular, did an amazing version of this on her record, Silk and Soul. Taylor had released a previous version of his own song, but this is just the trio version, but it is fantastic. Start off with a very kind of churchy feel. He's using his damper pedals as a very, very big sound, and then it really starts to swing in a very gospel-y way. It's a very, very moving song, just inherently because of the music, but also, of course, if you think about the context for it. The rest of the tracks on here are universally excellent. There's some variations in tempo, but what really makes this record is the quality of the sidemen. In particular, the phenomenal Grady Tate is here on drums, and his work on Morning, his work on Pensativa is just fantastic, and it's beautifully recorded as well. Much, if not all of the record, I think, is a live, it is a live club date, and the recording is very, very nicely done. Anyway, it can be easily found, this record, for not too much money, and it really is just brilliant, particularly if you like jazz with a little bit of gospel leavened in. So anyway, like I say, pick it up. The next record I want to talk about is something which just arrived, because I've been on a contemporary records kick lately, really digging into West Coast jazz, which I kind of poo-pooed earlier on in my collecting, and I've really come to appreciate more and more these days. And that is this really wonderful, delicious record, actually. It is called the Hampton Hawes Trio. It is Hampton Hawes' debut for contemporary, and this is a nice, tasty 1955 first pressing of this. It is his debut on record in theory, although he actually did some early recordings which got released posthumously. This is basically his first outing at the time. This is a very typical swinging West Coast recording, although funnily enough, even though this record has nothing to do with free jazz, it is in a strange way slightly responsible for free jazz because it is this record which convinces Charlie Hayden, who at the time is playing in his family's country hoedown band somewhere in the Great Plains, convinces him that he has to go out to LA and find Hampton Hawes, which he duly does. Of course, then he finds Ornette Coleman, and the rest is history. The record itself is unremittingly great. It swings really, really hard on tracks like Blues the Most and Feels Fine, and there's also one track where Hawes plays unaccompanied called So in Love, which is really, really very beautiful. Again, not that easy to find this one, certainly not early pressings, but well worth picking up or streaming or what have you in any version you can find. Hampton Hawes, I would say, generally underappreciated these days. But on the other hand, Hawes is pretty mainstream compared to this next guy. This is a record by a guy called Roosevelt Wardell and his trio with Sam Jones on bass and Louis Hayes on drums. And this is the only record that Wardell ever made. He made a couple of other singles, I think, but this is the only LP he ever made. He, for the most part, made a career as a sideman, not necessarily recording very much, but certainly in performance. He is discovered for Prestige by Cannonball Adderley. This comes out in 1960, and Cannonball had been signed to Prestige and had been retained by Bob Weinstock not only to record music for the label, but to act as a bit of an A&R guy and a talent scout. And so this actually is called a, as you can see, a Cannonball Adderley presentation. And there you can see, there is Cannonball overseeing the recording of the record. And in fact, he is the producer of this record as well. So it is a very, very, very good record, despite the fact that AllMusic, which hasn't deigned to actually write anything about the record, gives it 2 stars, which I just do not understand at all. It may not be the most innovative music in the world. I mean, this guy was a natural sideman, but his playing is bluesy. It's very crisp. The recording itself is excellent. And it's recorded at a time when almost anybody stepping into a studio was making great, great music. And this does not disappoint. Plus, I think the cover is one of the great covers of the era. Anyway, very hard to find this one. I was quite lucky to pick one up. But if you can find it, grab it. 4 more records to go. And so let's look at this next one, which is made by a guy called Bobby Timmons. Bobby Timmons, of course, made his name playing for a bunch of folks. He played with Cannonball, so there's a Cannonball connection as well. And he also played, obviously, with Art Blakey, because he's probably best known for being in the Jazz Messengers. And this is an interesting record, Little Barefoot Soul. It was actually supposed to be a quintet record, but 3 of the people that were supposed to show up didn't show up. The only people that showed up were Timmons himself, the pianist, and Sam Jones, the bassist, who's actually on the previous record by Roosevelt Wardell as well. So they were a bit stuck, but they'd booked the studio time. The clock was ticking. So somebody remembered that Ray Lucas, the drummer, was in town. So he shows up, and you get this very impromptu trio record, for which one can only presume Timmons, who brought a whole bunch of his own compositions in, had kind of imagined the instrumentation to be that of a quintet. So there's a little bit of a feel of, well, I guess here we are, we better make a record, which is also kind of the charm of this record. There's a lot of spontaneity, there's a lot of energy, there is some really, really hard swinging playing because it's Bobby Timmons, which is kind of what you'd expect. He was such a big part of the rhythm section in Blakey's groups. As I say, it's mostly originals. There's a lot of really funky stuff on here. There's also a really kind of edgy, unaccompanied version of Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen. Maybe it was reflective of his mood, having been stood up by the other players. But overall, a very, very cool record. Very, very nicely recorded. The Jones's bass in particular, really high in the mix. This is one of these records that if you're an acoustic bass nut, you'll just love this record. I also think it's got a fantastic cover. I don't know who this beautiful woman is on the cover, but it's lovely. And it's kind of from the era, this is 1964, so people other than white women were starting to show up on the covers of jazz albums made by black musicians. And this is one of the first albums I can remember where a non-white woman actually appears on the cover. Anyway, beautiful cover, beautiful record, well worth grabbing if you can. Here is one from about a decade earlier, the Ray Bryant Trio. Now, Ray Bryant has 2 records called the Ray Bryant Trio. One comes out in 56 and one comes out in 57. This is a 1956 one, which comes out on Epic. This has Bryant with Wyatt Ruther on bass and 3 different drummers. And those include Kenny Clark, the well-known bebop drummer, Joe Jones, the guy who played drums for so many years in the Basie band, and then somebody else called Ozzy Johnson, whom I don't know particularly well, and I don't even know if it's Ozzy or Ozzy. Anyway, they take turns playing on different tracks. There is also a bit of a cameo by Candido, the Cuban percussionist, conga, and bongo player who plays bongos on the first track of each side, which really are the real highlights of this record. It's a mixture of bluesy tracks, some gospel feel, obviously some Latin as well on Cubano Chant and Night in Tunisia, which are the songs that Candido plays on. And I find the whole thing is driven by this organic rhythmic sense that Bryant has. It doesn't just swing, it ultra swings, if that makes any sense. I defy you, for instance, to sit in your chair during Cubano Chant. And speaking of swinging, now let's move to the swinging 60s. And this record by that perky little piano player from Jamaica, Monty Alexander. This is a Japanese pressing. I am of two minds about obi strips. I feel I need to keep them on these records because that's what serious jazz record collecting people do. But I personally don't like them. And one day I think I may just take all the obi strips off and have a little obi bonfire. Anyway, if you have different thoughts about obi strips, let me know. Anyway, here's Monty jogging into the future on this record, Spunky, from 1965. And this is some cookin' soul jazz played by this guy from Jamaica who could really swing. It's got a little bit of that Austin Powers feel to it, which is suitable, I guess, for a record from 1965. It's got a little bit of calypso on it. It's got quite a bit of bop, and I can also detect a bit of an Ahmad Jamal influence in his playing as well. This is another one of these piano trio records where the rhythm section really makes or breaks. In this case, makes the record. Victor Gaskin is on bass, Paul Humphreys on drums, although it's a bit of a cheat to call this a jazz trio record because there are 2 or 3 tracks that are actually a quartet. And those tracks have Gene Bertoncini on guitar, Bob Cranshaw on bass, and Bruno Carr on drums. When I listen to this record, I'm transported right back to 1965, or I would be, except for the fact that I was an infant in 1965. But it's what I imagine the soundtrack to 1965 sounding like. So again, really lovely record, very nicely played and nicely recorded. And the very last record I'm going to talk about is not cheap to find at all. In fact, it's very expensive to find. You need at least $300 to get your hands on a copy. And it's also a bit of a cheat because it is a trio record, which is mostly piano, but it's also a little bit of a harp trio record as well. And that, of course, is this record by Alice Coltrane, Huntington Ashram Monastery. And it's named after the ashram where she was engaged in what would become a very profound and lengthy spiritual pursuit in the latter part of her life. As I mentioned, it's a trio record. It's recorded at her home in Dix Hills, the Coltrane family home. John, of course, is dead at this point. Ron Carter is on bass. Rashid Ali is on drums. Ron Carter, in particular, is fantastic on this record. The first side is Alice on harp with Ron on bass and Rashid on drums. And the second side is Alice on piano. And I think it's fair to call it a piano trio record because the piano tracks are a total of 20 minutes long and the harp tracks are only 18 minutes long. So it's a majority piano trio record. The harp side is very beautiful, as is the piano side. But for me, there is one standout moment on this, which is the bluesiest thing, which I think Alice Coltrane ever recorded, which is the very last track on the record called Jaya Jaya Rama, which just overwhelms me every time I hear it. And I can't believe that the piano riff at the beginning of that track has not been sampled by some enterprising hip hopper. Well, maybe it has been, and if it has, let me know in the comments. Anyway, this is really, if you can get your mitts on one, just a lovely, lovely record. Here's Alice, and there are her very interesting and somewhat quirky liner notes in here as well, and well worth picking up. So that is a little tour through 16 piano trio records. And no doubt I've missed some really good ideas and some people's favorites. And I will say, too, that I didn't include any Oscar Peterson because I'm going through a phase where I'm really of two minds about Oscar Peterson, and I'm struggling with that. And I think I'll do a video about Oscar at some point. Anyway, all those records I mentioned, I think, are really, really good. And if you have some suggestions for piano trio records, please do put those in the comments. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.